Welcome everyone to this our second event in the series of lockdown conversations at IOCS. It's good to see familiar faces from last time, from the first event, which was only, I think, sort of less than 2 weeks ago, I suppose. But in this period, time seems to really either compress or just stretch ad infinitum. But delighted to see you all. I'll just remind everybody what we're doing with these conversation events in this period of the COVID pandemic and the lockdown conditions in most countries. We intended to address the effects of this new pandemic on Orthodox faith communities, both in the UK and abroad. And we want to explore questions of theology, of dogma, of liturgical practice, of faith in the public and private space, all of the things that we tend to face as people of faith at this time. And in this particular conversation event, we want to touch upon lessons from the New Testament, things that we weren't able to do in the first session. So we'll start with looking at what the New Testament can teach us about conditions like these in which we find ourselves. We want to look today also at the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the modern world. What's happening at the moment has put into stark perspective the meeting between Orthodoxy and modernity. Again, how do we respond to these things as Orthodox Christians, or as the Orthodox Church, both as institution and community of faith. We also want to address the challenge, or the apparent challenge, to the Orthodox liturgical tradition during this period, and the ritual practices. And obviously we'll always make recourse to the patristic heritage in the Orthodox tradition. So we want to find out if we can find answers, or some insights from the patristic times regarding conditions of illness, of pandemic, of being unable to live one's Christian life as one would normally think. So I'm delighted to welcome the panel today. We have quite an international panel today. We welcome Father John Gillians, Father David Lowell, Dr. Sister Vasa Arin, Reverend Dr. Brendan Gallagher, and Dr. Mary Cunningham. We have two priests from the United States, based in the States. Sister Vasa is based in Europe, in Austria. Father Brendan is here in the UK, as well as Mary. And I'll just say a few words about each of them, so you know who the panel is. You might be familiar with some of them, but just to make sure that we know our speakers today. I'll start with Father John Gillians. He is an associate professor of religion currently and culture at St. Vladimir's Seminary, and he is a priest of the Holy Ghost Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He also has a role as an adjunct lecturer at Fordham University, where he teaches faith and critical reason. And for 7 years, just up until 2018, he served as Chancellor of the Orthodox Church in America, the OCA. But Father John is very dear to us at the Institute because he is the founding director of our Institute here in Cambridge. And he is more than just a friend, more than just a lecturer to us. He is sort of has an iconic status to many at the Institute. It's hard to disguise that. So Father John brings his research interests today into the New Testament, into pastoral theology, spiritual life, faith and culture, and ecumenical thought. And we look very forward to hearing from him very shortly. I will now introduce Father David Lowell, who is serving as a priest in the States as well. He is a priest in the OCA, and he's currently serving at the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Portland, Oregon, the Diocese of the West. We also have the joy and the privilege to have Father David as a director of the Institute, an American-based director, and he also has worked as an executive director for Raphael House. Father David brings a wealth of pastoral and theological experience today and always, having served and studied both in the US and Cambridge. And in my personal interactions with Father David, I was very impressed by his knowledge and experience as a priest. It's not every day that one meets someone that's been so well-traveled as Father David, and someone that has trained many priests in his own time, or shadowed, as it were, shepherded many young priests in his own time. And I've benefited personally just from talking to him on many occasions. So wonderful to have you with us, Father David, today. Our next panelist is Father Brendan Gallagher, who is ordained as a deacon in the Orthodox Church and serves here in the UK, but he spends most of his time as a lecturer, as a university lecturer. He's a senior lecturer in systematic and comparative theology at the University of Exeter, and he also is the co-chair for the Eastern Orthodox Studies Unit of the American Academy of Religion. He's involved in multiple research projects. I won't go through all of them, but he specifically conducts research in the areas of systematic theology, dogmatic theology in both Christian East and West. And he has lectured and written extensively on contemporary theology of Eastern Orthodoxy, on politics and religion, Christian ecumenism, and also interreligious dialogue. We're delighted to have him today with us. He's both a dear friend and a wonderful, wonderful lecturer. Thank you for being with us, Father Brendan. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome Sister Vasa Larin here for the first time at an event at the Institute. We're very grateful that she managed to get this time from her very busy schedule today, and every day these days, to take part in this event. You may well be familiar with Sister Vasa because of her very popular series of podcasts and YouTube videos, Coffee with Sister Vasa. If you know her, then you probably know that she is a prolific author. She's a liturgologist, and she teaches at the University of Vienna, the Catholic Theological Faculty there, liturgical studies. She worked closely with the late Professor Robert Taft at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome, and Father Taft directed her doctoral dissertation on the Byzantine hierarchical liturgy. We're delighted to have you with us, Sister. We look forward to hearing from you shortly. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Mary Cunningham. She is connected with the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham. She lectured for the Institute in the past for our undergraduate degrees. She's an old friend of the Institute, and we're delighted to have her back with us today. Her expertise is in the area of early church history, Greek patristics, and Byzantine and Orthodox Christian theology. She is currently doing research on the development of doctrine, devotion, and liturgical praise of the Virgin Mary in Byzantium. Thank you for being with us, Mary. Well, we look forward to your contribution today. Wonderful. So, I certainly need to take a break after 5 introductions. So I will open up the conversation by addressing a question to Father John Gillians. Father John, what can we learn from the New Testament about dealing with situations of crisis as a community of faith, particularly when our customs and rituals are being disrupted as they are now at this time?
Thank you, Father Dragos. And first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to be part of this this panel with friends, and to see so many familiar faces among the participants, and all of this under the umbrella of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies. It's very special to be involved in this. So thank you. I'd like, in a short time, I'd like to make 3 points just to get the ball rolling as far as the New Testament, to answer your question. A crisis, by definition, shakes the community. In that sense, Christianity was born in crisis. The arrest, torture, death, and burial of Jesus, the empty tomb, encounters with the risen Jesus, his departure at the Ascension, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. All of these were crises in the lives of the apostles and early church. And then repeatedly, the early Christian community was shaken by various other crises: persecution by Jewish leaders, conflict between Hebrews and Hellenists in Acts chapter 6, fierce debates over how much of the Jewish law to impose on Gentile converts. For example, the account of Peter and Cornelius in Acts chapters 10 and 11, and then the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, which was itself immediately followed by a sharp contention between Paul and Barnabas that resulted in a personal break and splitting their missionary work. Then you have Corinth, the community we know best in the New Testament, was riddled with factions. Galatia was so torn that it was in danger of losing the freedom and universality of Christ's gospel through their insistence on keeping Jewish tradition. Jesus and Paul both predicted that the community would face crises. In last Sunday's readings from Acts chapter 20, Paul warns the Ephesian elders that after my departure, savage wolves will come among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves, there will be some who will rise up speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after themselves. Paul himself was persecuted for allegedly being a breaker of tradition. So in tomorrow's reading from Acts, there is an outcry in the Jerusalem temple when he is seen there. Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching men everywhere against the people and the law and this place. The point here is that crises are not new. Secondly, what kind of crisis are we facing now? In the COVID pandemic, some of the staunchest defenders of maintaining all liturgical traditions, no matter what, no masks, no social distancing, no changes in communion, they see this as a test of faith. Either you believe God is with us or not. Test of faith, but not in the way these most conservatives are framing it. I see it as a test of faith in 3 particular ways, all of which have roots in the New Testament. First, it's a test of whether our faith in Jesus Christ is stronger than our faith in tradition. As Jesus told the Samaritan woman in John's Gospel, what mattered is not a debate about religious traditions, but worship of the Father in spirit and in truth. For such the Father seeks to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Secondly, it's a test of our faith in the full humanity and physicality of Jesus Christ. If Jesus in his earthly body is born of a woman, hungers, thirsts, weeps, suffers, and dies, if he is subject to all of that, then the elements of bread and wine in Holy Communion are also fully physical and are therefore, along with the spoon, chalice, priest, and servers, subject to conveying disease if care is not taken. The Epistle to the Hebrews underlines how essential Christ's real humanity is to our salvation. Quote, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same nature. For we have not a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And then third, it's a test, this particular crisis is a test of how much we're willing to do to feed, protect, and care for the flock for whom Christ died. Now, having made these two first main points, I want to add a third. Having said all of this, it also needs to be accepted that these are early days in what will, without doubt, be a long period of discernment in the life of the church. And we have people in our parishes on all sides of the current questions. The New Testament also has much to say about coming together as a Christian community, even, and perhaps especially, when members of the body of Christ have strong opposing views. Here I think the best response is St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, which we read on Forgiveness Sunday on the eve of beginning the Lenten fast. And I'll end these early remarks just with this passage from chapter 13, starting at verse 14 in the epistle to the Romans. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. Welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Some believe in eating anything, while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Father John. Thank you very much. Lots to think about, and we'll come back to some of the things that you've said very, very shortly. I'm sure people have already many questions or follow-up questions to what you've said. Thank you. Building on what you said, I want to address the next question to Father David, because both the New Testament context that you referred to and our current context, and some of the things that you've mentioned draw very powerful questions of pastoral practice and of how we deal with these things in a community, in a parish. So, Father David, I would like to ask you, because I know you have such a rich experience of ministering in various parishes in the US, and you've also known at least a couple of parishes here in the UK, here in Cambridge, both the Russian parish and the Romanian parish, but you've traveled a little bit as well. So what do you think are the best ways to respond to this crisis from a sort of good practice pastoral perspective? You'll have to unmute. Yes, thank you.
No, now I'm unmuted. Good, thank you. Yeah, I think one place to begin, I've talked to a lot of priests this past year, both during the crisis and before. And also I do clergy compensation, so I get to talk to a lot of parishioners about what they feel priests should be doing to grow the community. And so a lot of those things come to light in the current crisis. There is I think of it as a recessive trait, not the majority, and yet it's common enough. And certain priests that I talk to are very good about but this is not necessarily the best way to be limited to this, to have their interactions with the faithful be structured and formalistic. So they need to have a class, they need to have services, they need to have the structure of the communion. The idea of visiting the sick is to take them communion as opposed to stay in touch. For those priests that seem to only relate to their people through formal structure, the COVID crisis was for them, they might call it a spiritual crisis, but I thought of it as an emotional crisis for them. Their identity was stripped away. The way they exercised the priesthood suddenly fell away. Now, one of the deans in a different diocese talking to me about the same dynamic with some of the priests. These would be priests that wait for people to call them with needs. And so in the COVID crisis, it was an opportunity, and some of these clergy needed to be nudged in that direction to call parishioners. You had to shrink the distance in other ways. And so as I talked to some of these priests, there was just a reluctance. That wasn't what they did. They weren't familiar with it. A pattern often complained about in salary negotiations was that these priests didn't visit the former old people who had aged out of the parish unless they asked the communion be brought them. So this time, even bringing communion was difficult. So part of the way to deal with that was to call parishioners. It's a pretty simple task, but it was outside of their normal way that they had exercised their ministry. So it was difficult for them. Now, in contrast to that, I talked to some very extroverted priests who were excellent at doing that kind of thing and had a lot of good advice. And so I would kind of assemble all these different experiences. So the extroverted priest would say, you know, if you call somebody and ask them how they're doing, and you make the whole phone conversation about how they're dealing with the crisis, how they're dealing with this, after you've called everybody in your parish, you don't feel like calling them again. You don't want to have that same conversation the second time, because unless people are sick or struggling, it's boring. It's a boring conversation. He said, I always try to just find out what they do in their lives. Are they gardeners? Get them talking, and it shrinks the distance. So that's this operative. You know, when you're isolated, you find ways to shrink the distance, and so that would be the positive. And it wasn't using communion. Now, in the case of visiting old people, the people who are the priests who rely on formal structure all the time, and this is not a criticism of formal structure. It's a critique of people who rely on it all the time. I call it leading with the spoon. You're going to visit somebody and you got the chalice in hand and the spoon out front as you greet them. And that's not the best pastoral approach in every situation. The first approach is to know people and to be in contact with people. And one of the parishioners said, we need to know that the men in black have our backs, and that they are praying for us, that they are interested in us, that they're following us, that they're reaching out to us. So this is a certain element of social skills. Missionary priests who grow parishes usually understand this, because that is a growth dynamic in parishes. So it's been an opportunity to look at ourselves as priests. And I think it's those priests, some of those priests who are very structured, they really were having an emotional crisis that first 3 or 4 weeks, and they've gotten through that. And it's good to see, and it says a lot about how we approach ministry.
Thank you so much, Father David. Thank you very much. You've really, I think, touched on a key element here about the shrinking of the distance, and how much of that work needs to be is not just something that the priest does to the community or with the community, but also shrinking the distance within ourselves between what we're used to do, our preconceptions, even about our own ministry, and what ministry is about, in a sense. And that's one of the challenges of both this situation, but also of living in a modern contemporary context. I think it always challenges us to rethink and to find new ways of doing things while being true to our calling and to our tradition and our practice. And this brings me to a question that I would like to ask Father Brandon. I really want to ask you, Father Brandon, what do you think are some of the issues that, in a way, following what Father David has said, this COVID-19 crisis has highlighted regarding the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the modern world? The modern world often presents challenges, or is casually seen as being a sort of a problematic context for the Orthodox Church, particularly those more traditional, more, as it were, structured elements of the Church, as Father David has mentioned.
Okay, can you hear me then?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you so much, Father, and I'm just very pleased to be here. I particularly should commend the Institute for really leading on this in trying to have a pastoral, catechetical approach to this moment. To take up what Father David was saying, this is a moment of opportunity, and the Orthodox Church needs to think outside the box. And so in my brief remarks now, I just want to talk about that. So I want to talk about how coronavirus is, or COVID-19 is, coronavirus is the way that we just often hear about it in Europe, is an apocalypse in the Greek's understanding of the word, of a revelation of judgment and hope. So coronavirus has descended on our world as an apocalypse, a whirlwind, destroying the shelter of our fixed verities, ripping the roofs off of traditions, and throwing into the blaze of the sun the hidden sins and fragilities of our institutions. The whirlwind has caught the Orthodox world in the middle of a complete identity crisis. It is a church which is, in its liturgical consciousness, pre-modern. But at the same time now, it's having to face all sorts of modern issues, which really were bubbled up from the West, even though we, at least in our liturgy, come from the East. And it remained relatively untouched until now, and we haven't really faced these issues, these modern challenges. But there's a spectrum of views in which coronavirus kind of sweeps into our world. On the one hand, you have those who hold that the world is pervasively corrupt, that there's a secularist and liberal humanist agenda which the church must battle against. And Often you will hear from these same folk in the Orthodox Church about the feminist and sort of gender theory, homosexuality. They will list various different things. And some people who are a bit more nuanced will say, well, we need to witness. And so there'll be an emphasis on mission here in this context. On the other hand, you have those who want to engage the West openly, often decried as liberals, but and they will critique it at those points where it is not in line with Orthodox tradition and the Orthodox faith. And they want to respond creatively to modernity and to the issues ranging from climate change to sexual diversity. But often these people sometimes lose their way and, as it were, drink the Kool-Aid, to use a contemporary expression. And often they, as it were, regurgitate with a little bit of incense views which have nothing to do with orthodoxy. So both things have dangers. Now, in this context, the apocalypse of coronavirus reveals who we really are. It reveals, on the one hand, a judgment. There's lots of things in our liturgy about judgment, but judgment in the sense that we need to face up to change. But it also has hope. I will mention just very briefly the judgment aspects because I want to focus here on hope. First of all, it has exposed the limits of our ecclesiology by a top-down restricted notion of the Eucharist alone making the church. And you see this, for example, in certain theologians and people who say, well, since we cannot gather together, since we have no synaxes, that's it. Can't have services. And so it is impious to stream services and to do things online. This is something that, so you get lots of this sort of thing. This seems to me a failure on a big way of our faith. Secondly, you have those views which often are conspiracy theory-like, which they essentially see the world as evil. It's a sort of neo-Gnostic type thing, and they go into this view of looking for Holy Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Greece, and often, I think anyways, the sorts of views which claim they overly spiritualize the Eucharist, if you walk into the church, you will be free from the virus. This is of the same sort of mentality. So these sorts of views, I don't want to focus on them too much now, but I think this is the judgment aspect of the apocalypse. But there is also hope where we can cooperate with the Lord in our salvation, in fear and trembling, the hope where God will wipe away every tear of the eye that comes with apocalypse. And what we've seen during this pandemic is this empowered the laity as guardians of the holy, people creating church within their icon corner, within their kitchen, as my wife and I have tried to do. It also has forced on us major questions. What does it mean to attend a liturgical service? What can you be confessed or absolved online because you have no access to the sacraments of the church? Can you even receive communion in some sense virtually? So in short, where and what is the church? And this is the major thing, and I want to focus on this for the rest of my short time. It's also forced upon us to respond to social issues. And so for too long, the Orthodox have simply either been quietist in regard to all the raging social issues, or simply been reactionary. So you get people who say, well, the Orthodox don't do ethics. We don't do ethics. Ethics is something for the Catholics. And then on the other hand, you get those people who basically, ethics consists of sort of shaking the fist and talking about the evils of homosexuality and the evils of radical feminism. But really, in this context, dialogue becomes a bad word. And so there's been attempts in Orthodoxy to respond to social issues, to respond to the modern world. And one of the attempts has come from the Moscow Patriarchate. It was a real leader, a real pioneer in this issue. So in 2000, it had the bases of the social concept of the church. 2008, another document to do with human rights. But these documents, in my opinion, have their limitations. They're somewhat reactionary. One aspect, for example, is in the human rights documents that human rights are dependent upon moral behavior. So, of course, this is rather problematic, say, in regard to a gay person from the traditional teaching of the Orthodox Church, because they're breaking the traditional Orthodox positions. Therefore, they don't have human rights because they're not sort of going according to morality with Orthodoxy. So this is problematic, in my opinion. They also they have a vision of ethics, a vision of social ethics, which is sort of the law of God, and it comes from above. So it doesn't reflect this notion of doxology, of a vision that celebrates the worship of God. But recently, there's been a document which came out from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, from the Greek Archdiocese. I will give everyone a link to it right now.
Okay.
And this document called The Life of the World Towards a Social Ethos of the Orthodox Church. And it has something different. It sees ethics, it sees a response to social issues as flowing from the liturgy, flowing from communion. So the way that we treat our brother and our sister comes from our communion in Christ through the Holy Trinity. So this seems to me one of the blessings of this time, one of the hopes of the coronavirus, where we grapple with these issues. So, just in conclusion, coronavirus is an apocalypse, a revelation both of judgment and hope. It calls us to be creative as the church, the body of the living Christ, to share the wealth of our tradition in this moment of decision thrust on us by late modernity. To answer the calling, we must emerge from our communal, spiritual, and moral lockdown. We need to be like our Savior, iconize the cross in struggling together to understand how we fit into this world now, and be able in that to be like Ignatius of Antioch. Let me imitate the passion of my God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Brendan. Thank you very much. You've touched on fundamental issues about liturgical identity, the COVID sort of crisis as a revelation, as an apocalypse, as we all feel it, but also on the opportunity that lies in this challenge. And thinking of this opportunity and thinking of the challenge that we have in this time, which we most often feel, as you've also pointed, Father Brendan, at the liturgical level, because we're so used to a certain way of participating, a certain way of receiving communion, a certain way of defining ourselves as practicing Christians. I want to address this question to Sister Vasa, and Sister Vasa, sort of building on what Father Brendan has said, I would like to ask whether you feel in the same way that the current context is both a challenge and an opportunity for the Orthodox liturgical tradition, and maybe we have an opportunity for a revision, a fresh look at the liturgical practices. Are we seeing the limits being tested? Or is this the first stage in a process of renewal and of discovery?
Could you repeat the last part, Drago? Sorry, but
yes.
You're getting broken up from my end.
I was asking whether we're seeing the limits being tested, or are we seeing this as possibly a first stage, a first new step in a process of renewal and rediscovery of our liturgical tradition?
I would say both, and I just love what the previous speakers have said, and particularly right now, what Brandon has shared. Deacon Brandon, right, Brandon? Is this,
Yes, Deacon. He's Deacon Brandon. Yes.
I'm sure he's been called worse things than just Brandon. I'm just pulling your chain, Brandon. So I love that Brandon has formulated it as both judgment and hope. I think that it's definitely a cleansing kind of an experience, and it brings to the fore certain things that, as usual, history being an imperfect and human reality, and the church indeed being a divine human, body, as we all know. I think that neglecting that part of the humanity and also the historical changeable reality has led to definitely, forgive me, I don't remember who amongst the speakers already said this, but there is a misunderstanding about the vulnerability of the physical and indeed those sacred species that God willed it, to use in order to offer us communion with him. But on a deeper level, I think that besides the misunderstanding and the bad catechetical instruction in sacramental theology, that we're reaping the results of, because, in the vacuum that the poor understanding of liturgy creates, in the vacuum also of almost zero participation of the laity, and anyway, in a lot of the Orthodox churches, not all of them. In that vacuum, there's the resulting Eucharist only, and specifically that part of the Eucharist where you get something. And the consumerist attitude of the laity coming, also one can add, there's been an infantilization of the laity to the point where they are not accustomed to accepting responsibility for worship. There's, a neglect also of any service other than the divine liturgy, as if it's no secret to anyone that Matins is only there for the several fanatics who, are showing up, and there's one or two, for some reason, showing up and standing there in the pews. Vespers, oftentimes not served at all at many parishes. And the actual vision of what Holy Communion is, that culmination of going through those services, entering into the mystery of the feast, and then indeed partaking of the table. But now it seems that, as Father David has pointed out, this, also, I guess, that priests slip into this, that they can only, into this practice of reaching the faithful only through the Eucharist. But I would also, and I've seen in my own little activity, in discussing these issues and in getting questions about these issues, I would also see this in a hopeful light, that, in that very chapter of 1 Corinthians, chapter 11, where we have the earliest narrative about the mystical supper of St. Paul, in that very chapter is the famous phrase, in 1 Corinthians 19, that there must be divisions amongst us, that the tested, or the dokimi, be made manifest. So I would think that the way we react to the present scandal, I would say the scandal of the liturgical spoon, because it's a stumbling block on both sides of the issue. I think that having some patience, like hypomone, remaining behind sometimes, waiting this one out, and having some patience with allowing us ourselves to be tested and not jumping the gun, and also allowing church authority to be doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's not right for each of the faithful to have to decide this and prove his or her faith, or apparently lack thereof, because it seems to be on them. Brandon touched upon that this is an ecclesiological test. And, you know, I won't be the first one to notice that we have been for many, I would say, centuries in a situation of crisis of church authority. The inability actually to come together as, you know, for a pan-Orthodox council, even the last attempt to do so, for there to be a sidestepping of the actually most contested issues, you know, not touching upon something like calendar or divorce. I don't know if, and I'm familiar with the wonderful new document for the life of the world. However, the actual inability and the paralysis of church authority, because you see, I think a lot of the hierarchs would be completely on board with doing the responsible thing, because whatever you want to say about the issue at hand, there is a responsibility of the church authorities before the civil authorities. It's very hard to imagine, with not only with the present day restrictions, but the aftermath of this, of how the civil authorities will approach an entire community or cathedral that might not have a kind of custom that will be perceived, regardless of how the faithful perceive this, that will perceive with no problems the custom of a common spoon. And hierarchs do have to think about that. But, you know, the appeal to either the presence of a precedent in tradition or a lack thereof is overlooking the fact that church authority in the Orthodox Church has compromised in the way sacraments are done. If I name the example of ordination, for centuries, the 30th canon of the Holy Apostles about it being strictly prohibited to involve civil authority in ordination in the election process. And if we're not entirely innocent of church history, not only in Byzantium was that not the case, that civil authorities were not systemically involved, very much involved. And nobody said that ordination somehow or the actual sacrament was violated. I mean, maybe there were voices now and then, and, you know, in later discussions of Sergianism and far more recent discussions of, you know, certain church-state relations that are problematic. This has, you know, been concern about it has been voiced. Nonetheless, that imperfect reality of church history, you know, a lot of it is swallowed just by the humble carrying of the cross of history. So I'll finish now, but I think that this is a crisis of church authority and ultimately a faith in the church, a church that experienced robust change, especially, I would say, in the liturgy. The liturgy, and even specifically the way Holy Communion has been distributed, is really experienced robust change. So the fact that we don't believe that the church has the authority, and, you know, where the rubber hits the road, it is on the level of hierarchical decision. The fact that actually there is a fear, I think, amongst the hierarchy, and one hears this a lot, like in high placed, like church commissions. I hear this in Moscow a lot at the table in the various commissions of the intercouncil presence, both the Canon Law Commission, the Liturgical Commission. Oh, if we say this, there'll be schism. So it's not that amongst the decision makers there wouldn't be total agreement that something has to be modified, but the fear and the tail wagging the dog here a lot of the times, and I think sometimes being in denial as to it's our responsibility. The pastors have failed, the teachers have failed to instruct properly in these things. And, you know, because of this, there is a deep also mistrust of church authority. But ultimately, it's that the church of today, it's what Filadovsky would call also, it's tied to the theology of demise, that, you know, there was a golden age when the church legislated, when the church got together for councils, and then, I don't know, at the latest, you know, the year Gregory Palamas died, or maybe when John of Damascus died, you choose your endpoint, but everything started going to hell in a handbasket, and we just have to repeat, you know, what was done before that cutoff point. So I think taking it a notch down, remembering this, that there must be divisions amongst us, that we be able to be manifested as those who are not only tested, but hence reliable, is something to hold on to and to try, you know, in humility to trust that the Holy Spirit will guide the church in this.
Thank you so much, Sister Vesa. I agree with you very much. It's on the one hand, the multiple levels of the narrative that we need to be aware of. I often think of that episode in the Gospel where the apostles are going on the Sabbath day and they're just eating and just pulling the grains, you know, and then they're being told off by the Pharisees and so on, and sort of Jesus defends them, saying that you can't ask them to be sad when the bridegroom is with them. They will do what they will have to do because of the presence of the Lord among them. And I think some of that sort of courage we need to recover, I suppose, in that sense. Hopefully this will be part of that process. I want to say that a good thing, before I address the last question to Mary, my questions to Mary, is that we can already see some progress happening. All of the panelists here come from different Christian or Orthodox jurisdictions. You have OCA, you have Ecumenical Patriarchate, you have sort of Romanian Patriarchate, and so on. So we already see that the Orthodox are able to come together and sort of overcome our very fragmented, sometimes universe. Mary, what I want to ask is, in a way, related to what Sister Vasa was saying, thinking of the wider context that the Orthodox has always lived in, thinking of the civil authority, thinking of civil society, thinking of the way that we understand ourselves as church from the time of Byzantium and so on. So I would like to ask, how do you think that we can better harness our Byzantine, or better said patristic, heritage in dealing with contexts like the one that we are experiencing now? We always seem to want to go back, as Sister Vasa said, to that golden age. The golden age is there, but it doesn't have all the answers, I suppose, but we might find some answers that we could take forward.
Well, thank you very much, Father Dragos, for inviting me. It's a very large question, and I think I'll be veering away from the subject of liturgical theology a little bit, which I hope won't disappoint people. But rather than talk about the problem which so many people are discussing in relation to this crisis, that is our attendance in church and participation in the Eucharistic rite, which of course does have precedents and some answers in the patristic and Byzantine periods, I would rather look at two topics on which our holy tradition also provides guidance. And these are, firstly, the patristic understanding that God created humanity according to his image and likeness. And secondly, the directive which was taught and lived out in the early and Byzantine churches, that we should love and serve our fellow human beings. especially in times of epidemic, war, or other crises. So to begin with the Christian belief that we were created according to God's image and likeness, you'll all be aware, I'm sure, of the basis for this idea in the creation story that culminates in God's fashioning of humanity in Genesis 1:26. The Cappadocian Fathers, John Chrysostom, and other early Christian teachers stressed the nobility of humanity, free choice, and the capacity to develop the virtues because we are images, ikones, of God. The divine likeness for most of the fathers is something into which we can grow during the process of deification that begins with Christian baptism. This optimistic view of every human person, and I should add that the potential is there whether we're baptized as Christians or not, should permeate the policies of every modern society. Unfortunately, although many of us live in states such as Britain that profess to be Christian, we don't always see the concern and care for humanity that should be present. I was disturbed at the beginning of March or so, when the virus was just beginning to spread throughout our country, by the government's use of the term herd immunity. It has to be said that this terminology was fairly quickly abandoned, as our leaders, along with their scientific advisors, came round to the view that quarantine and protection, especially for the sake of our most vulnerable citizens, was the better way forward. However, the initial response did suggest, in a most unfortunate way, that the best way to get through this crisis with a minimum of economic damage would be to allow a certain number of people to be infected and possibly die with the virus. A second worrying trend, and again I can only speak from my experience in England, was the treatment of care homes for the elderly. Not only was there an initial policy to return older patients from hospitals to care homes in order to free up beds without first testing them for the coronavirus, but we're now learning that some homes were instructed not to call doctors or send elderly patients to hospital if they became ill with the virus. As more evidence about these early weeks begins to emerge, and yes, many of these policies are now being changed, it's difficult not to feel that our society has failed, at least in this instance, our most vulnerable citizens. This is an issue on which the churches, including our Orthodox jurisdictions, could speak out more than they have so far been doing. We need to defend our belief that every human being is an image of God, deserving respect, care, and love. And I'd like above all to see bishops writing to politicians about this issue. However, the lower clergy and lay people could also be speaking out. Secondly, I wanted to say something about the Christian imperative to serve and care for the sick, the poor, and the homeless in our society. There's ample evidence that the early Christian and Byzantine churches took this seriously and acted on it. Although such care may have been provided in less structured ways during the earliest period, it was institutionalized under the Christian Roman emperors. We think, for example, of the work of the Cappadocian Fathers, especially St. Basil the Great, in founding charitable houses of all kinds. From the reign of Constantine onwards, but especially under the 6th century Emperor Justinian, Constantinople was furnished with hostels for the poor and for migrants or foreigners, hospitals, orphanages, and other welfare institutions. Most cities and towns within the Eastern Roman Empire would also have possessed such facilities. In the earlier centuries, the responsibility for running them lay with bishops. Later, this was sometimes taken on by emperors or imperial monastic foundations, such as the Pantocrator monastery in Constantinople. But the point here, I think, is that Byzantine Christians understood Christ's commandments and indeed his personal example in looking after the ill and the poor. As for patristic or Byzantine responses to epidemic or plague in particular, there are many examples of recognition that such events call for benevolent responses from the state, the church, and all lay Christians. One of the most famous examples which has been cited quite a lot recently, is Saint Cyprian of Carthage's witness to the plague that struck North Africa in the second half of the 3rd century. Cyprian wrote in 2 treatises, including one that's called On Mortality, that epidemics such as the one that he and his fellow citizens were experiencing affect all people, rich and poor, righteous and sinners, Christians and non-Christians. While Christians have no special defense against illness, they do have hope in the final resurrection. But Cyprian says that those who are still alive should feel empathy with all sufferers and should do their utmost to help the ill and those who are impoverished as a result of the plague. Our modern Orthodox churches are sometimes described as being too vertical. That is, we focus on our relationship with God, and sometimes that's in a rather individualistic way, as opposed to working on the horizontal or human dimensions of our faith and life. It seems to me that the current situation, which the previous speakers have spoken so eloquently about as an apocalypse, a crisis, it's also an opportunity. It offers us the opportunity to redress this balance. And it's not simply an opportunity for our clergy, led by the bishops, to redistribute church funds or provide in some way for those who are sick or destitute. It's something that all of us as lay Christians can involve ourselves in. Such involvement can be done in the context of our parishes, and I know that many Orthodox parishes are organizing themselves to help weaker members of their communities, but it also can help in the context of our local communities. Most towns and cities in England have created groups of volunteers who help to collect groceries or prescriptions, or for those who are unable to go out themselves, simply to ring members of the community who are isolated and lonely. I believe that we can rise to this challenge using our historical tradition as inspiration and grow in the process. So a time of crisis may also be a time of opportunity for spiritual and personal growth in our Christian way of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you very much. I think your contribution in a way brought together a lot of what the other speakers mentioned, and it's always a good reminder to realize that Christians have been very able to respond to this type of situations, conditions of pandemics quite well in the past. And as you say, I think these situations are occasions, are opportunities to redress sort of the balance to the social balance, and to come to terms with some of the things that we take for granted in our theology and practice. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our panels. We do have a few more minutes left, and I want to also thank those who have sent questions in advance. We did receive a few questions, I think maybe up to 4 or 5 questions. Some of these questions, I mean, the panel has received them, I think. If any of the panelists would like to address one particular question or some of the questions, feel free. Don't have to wait for me to prompt you. But just to say that there seems to be a pattern to the questions that we received, questions that are addressing the very practical issues of receiving communion again, and transmitting sickness or a virus, a pathogen through the communion spoon, and so on, and whether we can find new ways to administer the holy gifts. I want to thank again people who've sent these questions. In a sense, some of these questions have been answered by the panel to a degree. But again, if any of the panel would like to pick up on one of the questions, you're very welcome. Father David. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, unmuted. The question of the use of the spoon, I don't have any issues. I'm totally fine with the way we've always served communion. If the bishop tells me to do it differently, I'm fine with doing it differently. The thing that's right within our control is partially in our control, is the fact that so many contagious diseases are spread when people are in small spaces or confined spaces with poor airflow. And our church structures vary a lot. Some have huge, great, wonderful ceilings. Others are missionary churches, and they're really pretty, sometimes a low roof and close in, and people are packed together. And one of the things that's within our power to do in every church, this relates to the priests, is starting liturgy on time. Now that is one of the most simple things in this crisis as we reopen. And one of the things that many priests, starting on time is not in the top 100 of their list of things that are important to do in a service. And I've been watching on Facebook the different lengths of services, same liturgy, and during the stay at home, the same number of communicants, which is 0 or 3 or whatever. And yet the length of the service will last sometimes 20, 30 minutes different. And so sometimes the different kinds of chant affect that. But even within the OCA, there's still a 20-minute difference. And in every case, it comes down to the parish that starts late. 10 minutes late is about as early as some parishes start towards being on time. 15 minutes late is common. And starting on time, they seem to have a shorter service. It's not any shorter. They just started on time. But you're reducing the amount of time, for those people who come on time, you're reducing the amount of time that they're spending in the enclosed space. Now that's something very simple that's within our power to do that adds to the health and welfare and well-being of our parishioners. To me, that's more important than anything with a spoon.
Thank you, Father David. Father Brandon.
Yes, I'm very grateful to all of the speakers. Just a couple quick thoughts. One of the things that I hope this pandemic will do is get the Orthodox to think more deeply and to be less fearful of being able to borrow the best of Western theology. Because we understand Holy Communion as mysteries, very often this seems to give some Orthodox the idea that it's almost as if everything which is earthly, everything which is human, everything which has to do with creation is somehow sucked out of the elements. This is something that I think Father John mentioned. It's a deeply unorthodox approach to the sacraments, very non-Chalcedonian in terms of this, and I think therefore this is why you will get, contrary to all scientific sense, we'll have people saying that you can absolutely never receive where there is, in some sense, literally, there's wine and there's bread in some sense. Now, there are different Western ways of obviously articulating this classically, and there even, I think it was the Council of Jerusalem, which adapted some Roman Catholic kind of models to the Orthodox context. So I think there needs to be less of this hyper-spiritualization. Part of this, I think, is, as I said, a neo-Gnostic aspect. It is the same sensibility that says that we can never respond to any issues that are going on in the world. Because we're just with the holy things. Now, in regard to spoons, I think that this is instructive of the way that we treat tradition. Are we going to treat tradition in a sort of slightly legalistic way where we find the one sure answer of how to deal with the situation now? So it's either, taking the elements, receiving them separately, a la the Liturgy of St. James, or spoons. It can never be one or the other depending upon the context. Or, for example, as I know, some people have used, wooden spoons and then burnt them. So if we see tradition as something creative, as something vibrant, as something where the Holy Spirit inspires us in our context, this will then approach the matter quite differently in regard to this, instead of looking for the one sure answer. And this is how I understood Daniel Galadza's recent, extremely, quite excellent public orthodoxy post to do with this whole matter. So we need to be creative. And there are examples of trying to be creative. I've mentioned one of them. I don't think that this is just the ecumenical patriarchate. I think in all jurisdictions, you see people trying to follow the Spirit. So that would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Brendan. Yes, what you said reminds me of Jaroslav Pelikan's famous tradition versus traditionalism sort of essay, and I echo what you said. I do want to address, before we open the floor to people asking questions from the audience, I want to address one of the questions that we received, the one regarding reason and belief, whether they exclude each other in the act of faith, because this seems to be somewhat a point of criticism, and a point of contention between Christians themselves and those outside of the church looking in, whether they're medical practitioners or scientists and so on. And the question is, does reason and belief exclude each other in the act of faith? And the pandemic gave us the perfect situation to assess this relationship. For example, if a person is well aware of the risk of contamination and chooses not to take the Eucharist, does it mean that his or her belief is weak? And then the opposite, if the person is well aware of the risk of contamination but still chooses to take the Eucharist, does it mean that he or she is in danger to itself or to others? So would any of the panelists like to address this question, this apparent clash between reason and belief, which is being made even more, or is being drawn into these lines by this current situation? Father John.
Thank you. Yes, I can say that on a very practical pastoral level, in many parishes, this is exactly the kind of conflict that is coming up. I mean, I just had this in my own parish discussions about how we should approach the possibility of reopening. And here again, I would go back to the point that St. Paul makes in Romans about not judging one another at this stage. Because you're going to find people have different perspectives on this, and if you come down too hard on one or the other, you don't want to be political, but it is pastoral. So you do have to, keep talking, keep teaching, keep informing parishioners about the wide variety of practices that are going on right now in the Orthodox world. Keep reinforcing the idea that Orthodoxy in particular is able to bring together faith and reason. I would say better than many. So it's being able to do these things in balance. The particular example that I've appreciated lately is the Orthodox Church of Finland, where Archbishop Leo, in a very beautiful pastoral letter, talks about not just the practicalities of what the church is going to be doing, but allowing a variety of pastoral responses in order to recognize that this is a new situation, that there is no, silver bullet at the moment, that people are thinking differently. Now, in that case, the Church of Finland is using wooden spoons. We don't want to harp on spoons all the time, but they're using wooden spoons as one way. I happened to look on their website yesterday. A priest in Finland is also using a plexiglass kind of, I would say wall, but a plexiglass for handing out communion. It almost looks like a bank teller's. You put your communion through the little hole and you're protecting everybody so he doesn't have to wear a mask. That may not be the wave of the future, but it testifies to this willingness to be creative at this time when we don't have a perfect solution. So I think this combination of practical pastoral approaches, reason, faith, all working together, we can do that. We can do that.
Thank you very much, Father John. Yes, I agree with you. I think people might be afraid that any well, not say change, but any creative approach to this might turn into some sort of new lasting practice. I mean, I wouldn't imagine that Orthodox iconostasis will include a plexiglass sort of a slider from now on, and not even in Finland. But I think we need to develop this type of thinking. How do we respond to a crisis? And then once the crisis is over, we can obviously take a step back and reassess the wider picture, but also we don't have to tie ourselves down to some of the practices that we might have introduced as a response to a particular issue. If anybody from those attending in the audience would like to ask a question, please raise your hand or type it in the chat, whichever you think is the best way to deliver a clear question and allow more time for an answer than for actually addressing the question itself. You're very welcome to do that. We still have another sort of 10 minutes from the advertised time. That's wonderful.
I can see Christoph, I think, had a question.
Christoph, if you, I can't see him at the moment.
He's there. Yes.
Well, if he's there and he has a question, he's very welcome to address it.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christoph. And then we have a question on the chat. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes. I don't mean to be the spoil spot, but I ask myself, why do we consider this particular pandemic, this event, to be an apocalyptic event? There are so many other events that are even worse, we don't consider to be an apocalyptic event. So that's the main question. For instance, when we take into account that every few minutes a child dies from hunger, or there are years where a lot more people die from virus infections and respiratory disease, a lot more, like sometimes 1.5 million people, and we don't care. So why do we consider this particular pandemic to be an apocalyptic event? That's the first question. And secondly, that's a kind of side remark. There was an interview with a professor from Oxford, Gupta. She's also an epidemiologist, and she said, the lockdown is actually a luxury that only the developed countries can actually afford, whereas the poorest countries, you know, the consequences of the lockdown will be so devastating that it's not really an option. So the main question is, why is this event an apocalyptic event and challenges the Orthodox Church and the whole world, whereas other events don't, that are actually much worse?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christoph. Well, I think this is squarely aimed at Father Brendan. I will allow him to answer first, but any of the panel members are welcome to respond. Father Brendan.
Thank you, Christoph. I'm using, and perhaps I should have been more clear about that. Apocalypse in its Greek sense of revelation, in the sense of revealing things in the way that they really are. Now, you could ask, there have been pandemics in the past. There have been major events in the past. Did they not reveal things as they were truly are, either in, as I've said, in terms of judgment or hope? Yes, of course they have. But I would say what makes this event unique and different, say, than some of the previous events is that it is the first one in the technological age. It is the first one where there appears to be, because of well, globalization in terms of travel, there is virtually, except for I gather Antarctica, no place on the globe that is not touched by this. In previous ages, when they had a major event, well, it would touch a part of the world, but other parts of the world would have a different experience. Even, I might add, during, if you read about the flu pandemic, there were parts of the world that were not as gravely touched. So this has this sense of, well, something akin to, for example, the icon there, of a revelation which is for all of humanity. An apocalypse which speaks to every single one. But I, as an Orthodox theologian, then need to ask, well, how does this speak to the body of the living Christ? How does this speak to the church? Because if the church is the ongoing incarnation, the presence of Christ in our midst, then it is all the more crucial that it is able to respond creatively to this moment and be able to witness to the whole world which is experiencing this, how Christ's church understands and wishes to witness to Jesus Christ and to this moment. Now, in regard to the developed world, as to whether or not they have lockdowns, I'm not going to radically disagree with this person, but if you hear about, for example, Ebola in some parts of Africa, there were lockdowns there as well. And in the ancient world, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts, you will hear about, for example, in England, if you hear about there being versions of a lockdown during the Middle Ages. Where people simply wouldn't come out because of certain things. So now, entirely locking down, perhaps that is a luxury, but versions of what we are going through were experienced in the past. So that's but thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Father Brendan. I agree that this is in some ways a leveler, but in some ways it just throws into stark perspective the huge discrepancies in our life, huge discrepancies in society between rich and poor, between people of means and people who are struggling even in sort of regular times. There is a question in the chat asking whether is there perhaps a risk to move from the notion of communion in the vertical and also horizontal sense to a more individual kind of spirituality, salvation or piety, even when we gather together. I sense that this has been addressed in the, thank you very much for the question. I think it has been addressed in the answers that we received, I think, but if any of the panelists would like to engage with it further, you're very welcome to do so. There is a raised hand from Alex. So please ask your question now. And
yes, question is just going to a kind of extension of what Father Brando was saying. Isn't it that part of the revelatory message to the church is that relationship between outdoors and indoors? So, for example, in the Gospels, everything is kind of happening outside, and in a very few chosen moments, things are happening inside. And as we know, that during this virus, being outside in a way is recommended as a better thing to do in terms of safety. Isn't that kind of, if we look in a kind of revelatory sense, isn't that how that reflects the outdoors indoors ratio that is taking place in the Gospels, and also hierarchical versus egalitarian? I think the egalitarian factor that is incredibly prominent in the Gospels has been replaced during the conciliar era with the hierarchical factor in the church. So isn't that another revelatory factor that took place in this period? This
Thank
is
you
to
very
Brandon,
much.
or to anyone else who wants to tackle on this.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you for your question. Yes, I would agree with that. There is certainly an interplay between what's happening indoor and what's happening outdoor in the Gospels. I mean, if any of the panel would like to take this up, Father John. I think you're already.
Thank you for that. You know, it never occurred to me. You're absolutely right that most of things in the Gospels take place outside, and that connection between the Gospels and what is being recommended now. In my particular parish, for example, we have a city church, very much in the downtown city, but we also have a park area. It was meant to be turned into a church years ago, but never was. So it's a park area where we will now, when we reopen, we will begin having our liturgies outside, at least for a period. And thank you for that connection. It didn't occur to me, so I appreciate that. Thank
you, Father John. Yes, just to say that, to give another example, possibly in Romania, which I am quite familiar with, well, now that the churches have been sort of reopened, they've only been reopened to a limited degree, and this opening is only allowing services to take place in the church yard. So the churches are sort of open in their outdoor boundaries. Again, this has been seen as an opportunity for the church to witness more visibly, I suppose, and also to be challenged in some ways. Yes, it makes for much more challenging participation when the weather is not friendly, I suppose. But at the same time, Christ is back sort of on the streets, is back on, the Eucharist is back in the open air, to put it this way. But I think this interplay between what's happening indoor and what's happening outdoor is very much kept in balance in the Gospels. A lot of very sort of intimate revelations of Christ to his apostles are happening indoor, both before and after the resurrection. So I think maybe this theology of the sacred space, both in the private and public sphere, could be also revisited. And this relates to one of the comments in the chat about priests offering the Divine Liturgy out of doors. Thank you for that, Dina. Well, I think we've reached the time limit that we've set for ourselves. I want to thank everybody for their participation. I want to acknowledge a message from Father Paolo in the chat saying that maybe we need to move on from just talking about the spoon. And I think that's exactly what we've been trying to do here in this session. And I'm immensely grateful to all of our panelists who've offered us such profound insight today and such varied insight today. So once again, thank you to Father John Gillians, Father David Lowell, Sister Vassa, Father Brandon Gallagher, and Dr. Mary Cunningham for the willingness to take part and for sharing such wonderful thoughts and also challenging insights, but also inspiring. So thank you all. Thank you for your participation, everyone that joined us. The video recording of this Zoom lockdown conversation will be uploaded on the Institute's YouTube channel in the coming days. And without taking a cheap shot at the end, do consider spreading the word about the Institute. Do consider a donation to the Institute, to the work that we do. I know that there are much worthier causes at this time particularly, but education and creating space for dialogue and creating space for reflection is also important. So I just wanted to share this as well with you. Thank you again to all. Hope to see you soon also in the flesh, possibly at an event of the Institute here in Cambridge, if God will allow it in the near future. God bless to you all. Thank you again to everybody. Thank you.